Hello.
There you go. I've started the recording. You,
Right.
you guys know each other of old, I assume.
Yes, yes.
Splendid,
We've drunk several pints in Birmingham.
fantastic. And you got comic conventions lined up. Do you know what? Let's keep all the chat for the show, shall we? Keep
Yes.
a powder dry. Hello, Nigel. Thanks for joining me. The
Um,
format. Have you listened to any of the previous ones? You have.
Yeah.
Well, don't worry if you haven't. All it's going to be is we'll chat for a little bit. Don't know how long, and then we'll look at one of your pictures. I think we will look at. Just trying to think at which order I did it in my previous shows. It makes a lot of difference, does it? Right. We're going to have a look at Nigel's first.
right.
And then Laura, you and I will try and guess what it is, where it's from. Nigel will reveal it, and then we'll chat. And then we'll do the same again for your picture, Laura. Let's begin. This podcast may include strong language. It may not. This podcast may include Kev re-recording the start 3 times because he's discovered he can't speak English. This podcast may include adult themes and strong language. It may not. Let's see what the next half hour holds. Hello and welcome to Comic Cuts, the panel show. My name's Kev F Sutherland. You might know me as a writer and artist for Beano, Dandy, Marvel Comics, Oink, Red Dwarf, Doctor Who, the Scottish Falsetto Sock Puppet Theatre, and my graphic novel adaptations of Shakespeare. But you probably don't. My guests today talking comics are Laura Howell and Nigel Aughterlounie.
Hello.
Hiya.
Thank you. Nigel, am I pronouncing Aughterlounie right?
You are, yes, yes. Most people try and start it with an ouch, saying ouch too, but you're getting it right.
Splendid. One thing I'm going to get right that is not worth getting right is I'm now going to play the theme tune. Brace yourselves. Comic Cuts. We're looking at a panel and we comprise a panel. There's a few of us. So the panel sees a panel, then we talk about the comics from the panel we've discussed and we call it Comic Cuts. Be honest.
I'm so impressed you do that live, Kev. I would have assumed it would be easier to just record that, but you know, you're very, very deft with saying it out.
There is a recorded vocal version. It's dreadful. So I thought speaking it out loud was the lesser of 2 evils. I have 2 guests with me today who brought with them a panel from a comic or something close. We're going to see if we can identify it and talk about it. Maybe we and you will learn something about comics we didn't already know, or maybe we'll just show off a bit and have an enjoyable chat. Let us see. Joining me from Birmingham is Laura Howell. Hello, Laura.
Hiya, Kev.
Was I right about Birmingham?
You're absolutely correct, yes.
And what is it you're busying yourself with mostly now? Is it Minnie?
My main job at the moment is drawing Minnie the Minx for the Beano, which has been happening since 2018, I think. But I've been working for the Beano since about 2007. But this is the first time I've been regularly drawing a character that people have usually heard of.
Well, yes, you started with some slightly more obscure characters in the early days, like...
Yes, I mean, the first thing I worked on for the Beano, in terms of my own strip, was Johnny Bean from Happy Bunny Green, which we like to refer to at the time as Asbo's Come to Trumpton. Because the editor had seen some samples of comic work that I'd done myself, a little mini comic with different strips in it. And one of them was a kind of sort of like a parody of Strawberry Shortcake with really cute little characters, cute visuals, and quite a nasty little sting in the tail. And he liked the idea of having a strip that looked sweet and adorable, but there was a kind of slightly dark and unpleasant undertone to it. Not too unpleasant, obviously, because it's the Beano, but you know.
Do you prefer getting to work on the classic characters or to have your own characters in there?
That's a tough one actually, because obviously with the established characters, there's this enormous legacy that they've got, and you're constantly thinking, I've got to do justice to this, because you know there's all the famous artists that have drawn them before me, and you know people have known and loved them for decades, so you've got to not mess it up. But yeah, I mean, I do definitely like drawing Minnie, but I do have a soft spot for Meebo and Zuki, which was the strip I was drawing about, I don't know, 7 years ago now, which was a cat and a dog basically kind of pounding 7 bells out of each other every week. And because I really love animation, so the opportunity to draw something that basically looked like a Tom and Jerry cartoon, just go absolutely mad with the visuals. That was such a pleasure.
They had manga anime influence, and you've also done Beano manga. You introduced something under that title.
Yeah, that's right. That was another idea of the editor at the time, Alan Digby, because he'd seen me draw kind of chibi manga style comic strips. I've got a book out that I drew a few years ago called The Bizarre Adventures of Gilbert and Sullivan, which is basically kind of a nonsense story set in Victorian England. And that was drawn in a chibi manga style. So the editor basically said, hey, what about if we try and draw Beano characters in that kind of chibi manga style, which, in case anybody doesn't know, it's kind of drawing normal characters but in a kind of short, simplified form, and they tend to have kind of more outrageous adventures than the more standard characters have.
It's very hard to describe these subcategories, isn't it? Because chibi manga and manga itself seems to have rules about ways that you're supposed to draw, or categories into which the characters are supposed to fall. I mean, chibi is very much I get a lot of kids in schools who dogmatically follow the how to draw rules, and I worry sometimes that it crimps their creativity. Am I wrong?
Well, I mean, anything that inspires kids to draw is a good start. But yeah, I approve of the many dozens of how to draw books out there, because, you know, if there had been a lot of those around when I was young, I would have been all over them, I'm absolutely sure. But I think there is something to be said for just absorbing the media that you like and reinterpreting it according to your gut instinct, rather than, you know, as you say, kind of reading a checklist of how it's supposed to be done.
But you as a teenager were drinking in manga already?
Not so much manga when I was a teenager. It was very much sort of traditional DC Thompson and IPC and Fleetway kind of comics when I was under the age of about 10. And then it progressed to Oink, the legend that is Oink. And then I wanted more kind of, more of that sort of humor comic. So I read things like, you know, Gas and Brain Damage.
Blimey, I've met somebody who's seen my work.
Representing Tales of Nambi Gate, I still love it. And I didn't really come across manga and anime probably until I was university age, so kind of 18, 19. So all of my early foundations were humor comics and cartoons, basically.
Right. Nigel, what was your early intake of comic material?
Well, my earliest was a thing called Pippin, I think, which was for like preschoolers, like 5-year-olds, that kind of thing. You know, the sort of thing you wouldn't be able to read yourself, but your mum and dad would read for you. You know what I mean?
Featuring Pippin and Tog.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, I've got a really old copy I found in a charity shop somewhere. But yeah,
a lot of younger readers won't remember Pippin and Tog. You'll have to Google them. They were made by the same people who made it was Peter Firmin, wasn't it? They made Noggin the Nog and later the Wombles.
Yeah, it was an animation. It was
small
It was
films.
a TV show, kids animation, and it was this was the merchandise or whatever, the comic that went with it. Yes,
That's right. They lived in Pogle's Wood, and the lead character was called Pippin, and the secondary character was called Tog. And I remember this because I went to a school reunion recently, and one of the lads there, Nigel Kilborn, hardly a lad anymore, and still to this day, he is called Tog Kilborn because he was small and I assume had pointy ears like a squirrel because Tog did. Sorry, Tog, if you're listening. We don't remember now why we called you Tog, although I do remember we called Banger Lloyd Banger because he looked like a sausage. So, Nigel, you started with Pippin. You must have moved on.
Well, I moved on, yes. I suppose it went straight into the Beano. Well, not really the Beano. When I was about 10, which all the kids in the Beano are 10. Dennis and Minnie, they're all 10, aren't they? Something happened 10 years ago, but we don't know what. And every kid in Beano 10 is 10 years old. But when I was 10, that would have been the start of the 80s. But I wasn't reading 80s Beano then. I was reading 70s and 60s Beano, especially Dennis, because I was reading the collected issues, the annuals, that were all at my grandmother's house. So that's how I first, even though like 80s Beano was on the shelves, I was reading like a decade or two before that, because my grandmother had a collection of these things, you know.
And those, of course, were what I think we'd call golden age. The 1960s Beanos and the 1960s Beano annuals have Dudley D. Watkins, and they have sometimes Ken Reid, and they'll have Davy Law's Dennis the Menace, won't they?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, I've got a few Beanos from that.
Really, that was the Pippin stuff was like hazy, blurry memories from when you were 5. You know what I mean? But the proper solid memories are of those early collections, you know.
But you then didn't set out to go straight into drawing comics, and especially not for the Beano. You took a quite circuitous route to get there.
Yes, yeah. I always liked comics. I went to art college, and I did when I first left art college. I did send a strip in. I wrote and drew a Dennis strip and sent it in, which got rejected. But it was a really nice like rejection letter, you know, saying it was good but not quite good enough and what have you, you know. So after that, I did a lot of different jobs, a lot of physical manual jobs, sort of skilled labour, I think you would call it. Working with circular saws and milling machines and lathes and all that sort of thing, all very non-cartoony stuff. But in the background, as a hobby, I would draw my own comics, you know. And then eventually, I landed at a toy company, doing the most boring job you can find at a toy company. It wasn't making the toys. It wasn't designing the toys. It was making the rubber molds for the toys, so that the rubber molds could be sent out to China, so that they could make thousands of copies. You know what I mean?
Are these any toys we might have seen?
Well, the toy that got me initially into DC Thompson, into the Dandy, was a toy called the Bogeys. And the Bogeys were these green.
Yes.
They were made out of plastic. They weren't really made out of snot, but they were supposed to be made out of snot. And the boss of the toy company at the time said he knew because he'd seen me like scribbling away in my lunch hour, you know. He said, "Oh, you draw comics. Can you draw as an advert for the Bogeys as a write it and draw it a full page strip, you know what I mean? So it didn't look like a traditional advert. He wanted something that looked like a comic strip. So I did, yeah. I said, yeah, of course. Get paid to draw a comic that would would go into the Dandy as an advert. So they were paying for it as to be an advert, you know, in the Dandy. And that's how I accidentally muscled my way into the Dandy.
Fantastic.
Yes, and it was after a few months, you know. I got it ran for ages. The comic strip. The comic strip actually lasted longer than the toys.
I must admit, I don't see a lot of Bogeys trading hands on eBay.
But the feedback from Craig, the editor, was always that the writing was better than the artwork, you know, which was odd to me. Didn't ring, which rang an odd bell for me because I always got like C's, D's and C's in English, you know what I mean? And I got A's in art, but I was getting told that my writing was better than my art.
Right.
But at this point, I didn't realise I was dyslexic. You know, I just thought getting a C in English meant I was no good at writing. You know, so why is this person telling me I'm good at writing?
Right. So you'd actually been done quite a disservice by the educational system then. Dyslexia, meaning that you were dismissed despite what you were writing.
Yes, and it was dyslexia was a way of the comic books, the comic strips were a way of telling a story using less words. You know, so you know, instead of describing what people were doing and where they were, you know, you could draw all that, and all you had to write was the dialogue. You know.
Do you actually do your scripts that way, as drawings with pictures, or do you do them as full type scripts?
Yes, I'm a proper real writer now, and I do write books and things like that. You know, that are just words and things like that. But when I first got the job, when I was first offered the job of writing Dennis and what have you, you know, I was in my late 30s, but I was still had this thing hanging over me of school of the C. I managed to scrape a C in the end, the C grade in English, and I didn't know at the time. I still didn't know at the time that I was dyslexic. So I think it was that nervousness of like writing something proper, writing something that was purely text. That maybe chicken out of like when they asked me, I just said yes. Can I just do a rough script, a rough strip, and then the real artist can redraw it better, you know. And luckily they said yes. So I've stuck with that way ever since.
So this leads to you writing and drawing the Numbskulls, but being the lead writer for the last few years on Dennis the Menace.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
You've made some big changes to the universe of Dennis, including the identities of his dad and his granddad.
Yes, yeah. Now, normally, such changes and such developments, things like that, you know, will always be like decided at Beano Towers, you know, and being quite big things. But I just threw it. I had the idea one day. I started writing Dennis just after Dad got a makeover. Gok Wan gave him a makeover and turned him fun. If you remember, he was like bald with a pinstripe suit and a mustache.
Yeah.
And then he got a makeover to look a bit like Dennis. He had like similar hair, you know, if starting a bit further back, you know. So I started just after that makeover had happened, you know. So I just threw it into a script once. It was where the Dad was trying to take pictures of Dennis, and then it referred back to a time when Granddad was taking pictures of Dennis, and you know, before like digital photography and all that business, you know what I mean? So it was just like a throwaway thing. That's that the original Dad had now become the Granddad, you know. And I was expecting like some sort of like, oh, wait a minute, Nigel, what's going on here? What are you doing from Beano Towers, you know? But they must have liked it and accepted it straight away, and now it's become law. It's become canon. that the Dennis, if you're old like me, the Dennis that you read grew up to be the dad, you know.
If the Beano had the same sort of fanatic fan following that you get for Marvel superhero comics, we would have people delving into this and writing entire books about this canon, and then they'd start correcting us about the timelines, wouldn't they? They start saying, yeah, but if one generation in 1973 was this age, then in 1958 he couldn't possibly be. And then it'd be, surely he was in Beano Town 616.
Yes, yeah. The maths don't work out properly, and as time goes on, they work out less and less. You know, because everyone's frozen in time, really, aren't they? Dennis is always 10, you know what I mean? But
yeah, and it's almost like we've realized you shouldn't take these things too seriously.
No.
If I can pause for a second, I've got to close this window.
Oh.
My question to you, Nigel, is what's the deal with Nasher? Has he been cloned over the years many times, or is he just immortal?
He's immortal. But that's never mentioned. There was quite a recent 1 or 2 years ago, an annual where Dennis travelled back in time. So he met his granddad, and he saw his father as a kid who looked just like him, you know. And there's a little throwaway line, just one little bubble where Nasher thinks, I hope I don't bump into myself. I don't want to explain how come I haven't aged. And then I've just left it at that. There's no explanation at all, you know.
Perfect. I think we should have a look at the comic panels that we've brought in with us. I would like to begin by having a look at the panel that's been brought by Nigel.
Right.
Hang on, bear with. It's coming up.
Right. All right. I was going to say, I don't know how to do this.
Can we all see it now?
Yep.
Excellent. Is it? Oh, hang on a sec.
Do you recognise it, Laura?
Is it all nice and big and screen? Wait. Before anybody guesses at what it is, we've just played a sound effect, and then I'm going to say, I've asked everyone on the panel to bring a panel to the panel. You can see these images on my website at kevfcomicartist.com or on my Twitter, and you should be able to find it on the podcast page, depending where you get your podcasts from. But you don't need to see these images because we are going to be able to describe them. Aren't we, Laura? Laura, have a stab at describing, without necessarily guessing if you already know, what we're looking at.
Right. Well, my immediate reaction looking at this is I'm glad I didn't have to draw this. Nigel, please never put this in a script for me. So it's a very wide panel. I would imagine probably it's full page width in context. It takes place at night. We're out in the open. There's vegetation in the foreground and a single character kind of hiding behind a tree on the right. They're saying it's a freeway, we're saved. And what they're looking at is a massive kind of clearing, I suppose, filled with spotlights on poles, rows and rows of diggers, cement mixers, various other kind of large construction vehicles like that, kind of going back as far as the eye can see. There's a helicopter making a loud noise going overhead. Would you like me to do the helicopter noise?
Please.
Chunga, 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 chunga. There we go.
Beautiful onomatopoeia. Can I just say, for the benefit of the panelologists who are listening, the people who study line and this sort of thing, we're looking at a black and white line drawing, printed black and white. I don't think this was ever intended to appear in colour. Lots of chiaroscuro, an awful lot of hatching and detail, showing the difference between the dark of the bushes that are in the foreground and the light of the spotlit at night vehicles that are on this road. They appear, in fact, to be laying the highway. Now, I have an idea that I actually think I know where this is from. So, Laura, do you want to have first guess?
I'll be honest, it's not something I recognise, but if I had to take a guess, I'd say maybe something from underground comics, possibly.
Yeah.
Not sure.
Well,
The art style seems familiar, but not enough for me to make an educated guess.
I would say underground comics is exactly it, because I think we're looking at the artwork of Gilbert Shelton, and I think it's from the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers. Nigel, are we right?
Yes, well done, yes.
Tell us more.
Yeah, it's from a comic called Grassroots, and it's where the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers move out of the city, end up moving out of the city into the mountains to grow weed and what have you, you know. And it being the Furry Freak Brothers, all their plans fall apart.
Now, a lot of listeners might not have heard of the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers. They're very much of their time and of quite a short period of time, aren't they? They appear at the end of the 60s and then they stop appearing in the middle of the 70s. Am I right?
Yes, yeah. There's only 12 comics were made. I think that's right. And it came out nearly like a year or something like that. Very sporadically. You could never, back in the 70s or whenever, you couldn't rely on the next one ever coming out. You know.
You were relying on hippies.
Yes, yeah, very much so. Yes. The Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers are just three. They're not related, you know. They're just hippies who they're, they're who get stoned, and it's the adventures that they have, the trouble they get into.
You describe this in a very matter-of-fact way, but really we're talking about characters from over 50 years ago. And are they recognizable archetypes now? They're three stoners.
Yes, yes. No, I don't think they are. I don't think you see such people about anymore. They're very much of their time. And when I first found them, I was into comics. I was at art college, so I would have been about 19 or something like that. And I just found them at the back. Found one at the back of the comic shop. I was leafing through it, didn't know what it was, you know, because I'd never seen such a thing before, you know. These were like the 70s underground comics, you know.
Underground was an interesting expression of the time. Basically, the contrast to mainstream, wasn't it? In the case of mainstream comics in America, you would have had Archie comics, and you would have had DC comics, and then you would have had Marvel comics. They were on the newsstands, they were available to everybody, but they were targeted almost entirely at 8 to 12-year-old kids. Underground comics were people who appreciated those comics. They were often really big fans of people like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, but they wanted to do comics for grown-ups. And so Fritz the Cat by Robert Crumb would have been a very good early example. And in this country, Oz magazine, which I think reprinted the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers. It was the Alternative Society's comic strip, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. And I mean, I was at art college, so I may have been dabbling tiny bit in such things, you know. But while a lot of um, uh, student types or whatever, or stoner types might have been reading it because of the marijuana in it, I suppose. I was reading it purely for the comics, purely for the enjoyment of the craft, the writing and the artwork that Gilbert Sheldon was doing there. I absolutely loved it. And it shares a lot of DNA, I think, with the Beano, in that the adventures they have often have like very small starts, very small beginnings, you know, very domestic beginnings, and then ramp up and go off on tangents, massive tangents, and that often happened in the Beano as well,
It's hard to think of any other humor comics of the time. I mean, the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers stories, being a comic length story of 20 or 30 pages, reminded me more than anything of Asterix books. They were the only comparable thing I'd read at the time.
Yes, yeah. Humor in comics seems to be very rare. And I'm a big fan of humor, and I'm a big fan of comics, but the two things don't seem to want to fit together. I remember getting rejected from Fantagraphics. This is decades ago. I wrote and drew some comics on my own. A character called Pig Boy, Bunny Girl and Pig Boy, and I sent them into Fantagraphics, and I got a. This is back when rejection letters came through the post on paper, that sort of thing. That's how long ago it was. It was a standard rejection, saying no thanks, but no thanks, but at the bottom, handwritten along the bottom, there was a note saying, but we want you to know something along the lines. We want you to know how we passed it around the office and we thought it was very funny. You should write for TV or something. I think they mentioned Friends. You should write for Friends or something like that, So yeah, too funny for comics apparently.
That's really interesting, because actually laughing out loud at a comic, I don't think I did that until Viz comic, which is 10 years after Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers. Viz in Britain, not to be confused with the Japanese Viz. Viz comic with Sid the Sexist and Johnny Fart Pants. They were laugh out loud funny and very much the British equivalent of the American underground comics. Laura, did you ever come across the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers?
I'm familiar with them, but I mean, fairly recently, in the last kind of decade or two, I suppose. I think it was probably another thing that I encountered when I was at university. But I mean, obviously, looping back to underground comics, I started working on the Beano on a strip with Hunt Emerson, who is a very well-known figure in British underground comics and also a Beano artist.
Yeah.
And I was certainly familiar with his artwork from, again, things like oh God, we're seeing gas or brain damage. One of those two.
I think it was he's probably in both of them. He was certainly in one called Elephant Parts, which he did the lead stories for. And Talking Turkey, that was one of his.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I've read a little bit of Freak Brothers comics, but it was kind of a bit before my time, really, I suppose. But yeah, it's certainly something I'd like to read more of.
It's something that sums up the spirit of the time. I mean, we sometimes refer to things as being before our time, and for a lot of comics, that's significant. In the case of this, that period of time, this is the Woodstock generation that the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers are representing, when America was discovering drugs, discovering alternative society, starting to say out loud, there must be a different way other than the organization of capitalism. And the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers spend a lot of their time questioning and attacking capitalism. In this particular picture we're looking at, they're laying a road, and I'm imagining this story is about the desecration of the countryside and the invasion of the cities, isn't it?
Yeah. See, there's a lot. Naturally, it being the Furry Freak Brothers, there's a long, convoluted story of how they end up in the mountains. They end up with in the mountains with a year's worth of cocaine and lots of money as well, and they use it all up in the first week or the first few days, and then get like trapped in the mountains and lost in the woods and things like that. They're stumbling in the darkness, like close to death, and then they hear this rumble, and here comes a freeway, and the freeway is being built, like all in a line, and there's like helicopters coming in with the street lamps, putting them down and things like that, you know what I mean? And behind all the construction equipment is the traffic. The traffic's coming in behind it, you know what I mean? And it's very much the sort of thing they were against, and what have you. You know, they were trying to get away from civilization and the city and all that business. You know, and in the end, it saved them because this freeway came to them, chewing up all the forest, and he's like eating it up. You know.
Well, this is the significant thing about the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers and a lot of the underground comics is that it's satire. It has a point. And similarly with Viz. Viz is looking at society and reflecting it back. It's not just knob and bot jokes. It is actually has a message.
Yes, yeah, it does. Yeah, but what I like about it as well is that it doesn't take itself too seriously, you know. So it's got that underlying message, and then at the end, this panel is from the end. It's the punchline, basically, you know, where it had this message of like an alternative life, living away, and like living off the land and all that business, you know what I mean? And then the punchline it was that capitalism, I suppose you could say, you know, consumerism came and saved them. You know, which would have been like not at all what Gilbert Sheldon believes, you know, but he's poking fun, I believe he's poking fun at himself as well in that, you know.
I think this is how irony works. It's very interesting to see it in the present day, seeing these comics 50 years later and seeing how the world changed, how the hippie generation became the 1970s me generation. And yet at one time, they were these innocent stoners who just innocently took £1,000 worth of cocaine up to the Hollywood Hills. The nursery comics of our day. Laura, shall we have a look at what you've brought? Listener at home, we're looking at the comic strip panels that Laura has brought with us. You'll find these on my website, kevfcomicartist.com. You should find it on the source panel from the episode of the podcast, but you don't need to because we're about to describe it. Aren't we, Nigel? What are we looking at?
Yes, it's a question of 3 panels. It's the morning. A girl has woken up. And she, her face is obscured. We can't see her backs to us. As she goes to see her, she bumps into her mother. Is it? And her mother's screaming. What are you screaming at? After all, and then the next panel, her mother's on the floor, and the girl's screaming. I don't know if she's fainted or just the look of her has killed her or something. I don't know. Yeah.
We're looking at the final 3 pictures of a story, and I'm guessing it's a self-contained short story. And in this final picture, well, the anti-penultimate picture, girl wakes up. Penultimate picture, girl confronts her mother. We still haven't seen the girl's face. In the final picture, the mother has fainted, lying on the floor, and the girl turns around. Now, the girl's face is supposed, I assume, to be distorted and ugly. To me, it just looks badly drawn. I've done faces that looked as cockeyed as that.
Yes.
Nigel, have you any idea where you think it's from?
I think it's from Mandy. I'm going to say Mandy.
For the benefit of the panelologists listening, the people who study line and proportion and composition, that kind of thing, we are looking at a black and white line drawing that was printed in black and white. Quite a lot of hatching in a style used by European artists who worked on British comics in the 70s, 80s and 90s. I think this is from a British comic. I think it's from a British... I would have said IPC weekly comic, although their voice bubbles are typeset. And the end flash, the end caption in the final picture has got a little silhouette of a bat in it. And that suggests to me that it might be from a horror-themed comic. Laura, would I be right in guessing this would be from Misty?
Well, yes, you would technically be correct, Kev. It's from Misty issue 37, I believe. But if you want a twist in the tale,
Yeah.
I've never read Misty. I came across this comic in Barbie magazine in 1985. I was 9 years old and a little Barbie fan. And I thought, oh, Barbie's got a comic. Brilliant. Barbie Adventures. And in case, for some weird reason, you two guys weren't reading Barbie comic in 1985, yeah, I should explain that the bulk of the comic was cute little strips about Barbie and her sister Skipper. They go to Disneyland in one story, and they find a lost horse in another, and it's all very wholesome. But to fill the pages, because they clearly didn't have enough budget to have original comics in the whole thing, they padded it out with reprints from Ginty and Misty. So the Ginty story was a kind of typical schoolgirl thing. And then at the end of the comic, there was this kind of horrible, nightmarish story to me as a 9-year-old about a mean girl who's, you know, she's teased and bullied by everyone in her school because, you know, she's got spots and bad hair and all this business. And she says, no, I wish I was pretty, then everything would be fine. And she's gifted a magic mirror by a mysterious old lady who warns her that it will give her what she wants, but she must never let any harm befall it. But she gets more and more beautiful, which is what she wants, obviously. But she continues kind of being a massive bitch to everyone. So in a classic you had this coming twist, she breaks the mirror when she has an argument with her stepmom who's in that panel there. And obviously at the end of the story, she's broken the mirror, so her reflection becomes distorted. And so she now has this horrible kind of distorted face that she's got to live with for the rest of her life. This is not suitable material for Barbie fans. But even now, after what, 35 odd years, this comic is absolutely seared into my memory. I don't remember anything else about the kind of, you know, cutesy toy tie-in comics I was reading at the time, but I've never forgotten this mirror story. And I think it's one of the things that's kind of laid the foundations of my lifelong love for both horror stories and kind of, well, literal Black Mirror kind of twist in the tail stories.
The short story horror story in comics is it's perfectly made for it, isn't it? I mean, some of my favorite stuff is EC horror comics of the 1950s. And I remember getting an annual in the 1970s, The Buster Book of Horror, I think it might have been called. And it had similar short stories, 5, maybe 6, 7 page long stories. There was one drawn by Joe Colquhoun. And I'd never seen short horror stories before. I'd never read the written anthologies. I mean, Laura, were you a reader of that is to say, a reader of books without pictures in?
Oh yes, definitely.
But not horror.
Certainly when I was a teenager, I was reading quite a lot of kind of horror themed books, but not at this sort of age. It was more kind of, I don't know, fantasy type stuff and Secret 7, Famous 5, all that sort of business. So yeah, I was reading plenty of books. But I was also reading, in addition to the you know, funny comics that I mentioned at the top of the podcast, like Beano and Buster and all those. I was reading a lot of girls' comics, like Bunty, Mandy, Susie, etc. And actually, a lot of those had at least one kind of scary story in each issue. I think people don't give girls' comics enough credit for the range of material they had in them. I think if you ask most people about them, they'll just say, "Oh, girls' comics, it's all, boarding schools and looking after horses and things like that." But there were some nasty stories in there and quite bleak ones as well.
Yeah, those criticisms would definitely come from people who haven't read them. A few years ago, The Guardian did some facsimile reproductions of comics. There was Roy of the Rover, there was an old Beano, and amongst them was Bunty and I think June. And the girls' comics were head and shoulders above their contemporaries. Roy of the Rovers was neither well written nor well drawn particularly, but the girls' comics were a very high demanding level of storytelling. And of course, the wide ranging subject matter. The boys would be adventures and guns, sometimes sport, but usually violent. But the girls were psychological, they were romantic, they were sometimes mundane. They tend not to go into fantasy so much, or if they did, it was interesting fantasy, not just spaceships and definitely not superheroes. Yes, if anybody's read these, and especially Misty, they wouldn't have those generalizations in their heads.
I mean,
they reminded me a lot of Tales of the Unexpected.
Yeah. I was going to say, I often think, going back to manga again as well, that the popularity amongst female readers with manga that's been going on for the last 10 or 20 years in the UK, I think those kind of desires for dramatic, kind of traumatic, those kinds of stories, those needs were being met by the girls' comics before manga made its way to the UK. Because we've got the same sort of thing, serialized stories. Manga is, serialized. You're always looking forward to the next volume. And nearly all the stories in girls' comics were, oh, what's going to happen next week? Will her wicked uncle find the secret letter she's just hidden under the cushion or whatever? I think it's a shame that girls' comics aren't around anymore, because I often wonder if they could find that level of popularity again, now that people have, got this appetite for manga style serialized storytelling and very broad range of styles and subject matters.
Well, it's very significant that Rebellion Comics, the people who published 2000 AD, and of course a video games company, they are reprinting many of the IPC and Fleetway comics that they have the rights to. And Misty is one of them, as well as reprinting old stories from Misty, which are available in trade paperback or graphic novel versions. They're also commissioning new stories. They've put out Misty and Scream specials. Scream was, I suppose, the boys' horror comic at the same time as Misty was the girls' horror comic, and Rebellion now own those rights, so they are investigating whether there's a market for a whole new load of just this kind of horror. Whether you'd call it a girls' comic now, I don't know. Do you think you would?
Well, I mean, I bought the Misty and Scream specials that have come out in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I bought the Misty one as well.
Yeah, I mean, would you call it a girls' comic? I mean, I certainly wouldn't call it a boys' comic, but it has probably moved into the area of just being described as a horror comic for any gender. But then, you don't want to make it feel like female readers would be excluded from that.
I think if it gets into the area where manga readers would see it, and my experience in schools is that it's teenage girls who are the primary manga readers. At the age of 14, 15, they will discover manga, make it their own, share it, spread it. It becomes that thing. Boys, a lot less so. If this new material gets to them, my feeling is if it's good enough, then it could well find the market. They feel, I think, Rebellion, that they have to do it all in color, which I think makes it a bit too expensive. Manga isn't in color, so you get a lot of good reading without having to waste a lot of money on it.
Yes, it's like Sonia was saying in the episode previously. You know, manga readers in Asia will expect to consume a lot of pages in each chunk of manga that they read, and it will come out regularly. So, you know, we certainly don't want to get into a situation where British artists have got to kind of, you know, work 24/7 to create the sort of output that manga artists have to produce. But only stories like these, you know, if they were brave enough, I feel they could fly in black and white, because you can be so moody with black and white artwork.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to feel like you know, you just skimping on color to save money. It can be a excuse me, it can, you know, definitely be a stylistic choice.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely not think that, because my 3 new graphic novels are all done in black and white, and that's how I'm able to do 120-page long books and still sell them for £6. Available on Amazon now, reader. And thank you, Laura, for the call back to an earlier episode. Laura was referring to Sonia Long, who appeared alongside Nigel Parkinson, who of course draws Nigel Aughterlounie's Dennis the Menace, and you'll find that wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Nigel. I've had with me Laura Howell and Nigel Aughterlounie, and we have been looking at The Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers by Gilbert, Shelton and Dave Sheridan. And we've been looking at Misty, published by Fleetway and IPC Comics from the 1970s, writer and artist anonymous. Actually,
Kev, I did look up who the artist is for this, so I can give you that if you'd like.
Go for it.
I believe it is someone called, this is a Spanish name, as you correctly identify, European artist. So I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Isidre Mones. So there you go.
Fantastic. Oh, well,
I can't tell you the writer, though, I'm afraid. Sorry, Nigel. No disrespect to writers. I just couldn't find it.
You never know. This could have been one of those writers who went on to be a familiar name working for 2000 AD and other Fleetway titles. Maybe somebody out there knows. If you want to get in touch with us and tell us about these things or ask us anything, you'll find us all on the socials. Laura, where will we find you? I'm
on all the socials as at Victorian Clam, but you could go to my website, laurahowell.co.uk, and all the social links are in one convenient place there.
And Nigel, where do we find you?
I'm pretty much just on Twitter at Spleenal.
Spleenal?
Yes.
Why Spleenal? Why Victorian Clam?
That's a reference to the first ever Gilbert and Sullivan strip I drew, and it's just kind of stuck.
And why Spleenal?
Because I used to be angry, and it was just like venting and shouting, you know. I've mellowed. So.
Rather disappointingly, I'm on Twitter at Kev F Comic Artist, and you can also find me on the website kevfcomicartist.com. Please click subscribe to be sure of hearing every episode when it comes out. Thanks again to Laura Howell and Nigel Aughterlounie, and to you at home for listening. I've been Kev F, and this has been Comic Cuts, the panel show. And we're out.
Hey.
Thank you. That was brilliant fun. That went exactly where I wanted that to go. Well, I mean, I wanted to not know where it was going to go, and it went places.
I wish I'd remembered to mention that I had a friend at university who was also a kind of comic and animation fan, and we got talking about this particular story, the Mirror story, and it turned out that he remembered it from his sister reading Barbie comic in the 80s as well. So I reckon we need to have a support group for little girls that read this story in the 80s, and their brothers, perhaps.
Brilliant. Fabulous. Guys, I'm going to let you go. And a little bit later, I'm recording with... who am I recording with later? I'm recording with Laura Watton. Do you know Laura Watton?
Oh, yeah. Pink Apple Jam.
Pink Apple Jam. Yes, good. So I shall send my love. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Nigel. I'll tell you when it's going up, or I'll end the recording.